Yeah, hi everyone. Thanks so much for joining. I'm Bodil. I work at Unlocked Graduates, which is a criminal justice charity. We place transformational graduates like yourselves to work in the prison service for 2 years and make change from within. So I'm the COO there. Prior to that, I was in another role in the organisation. I was programme director. Prior to that, I actually came directly out of teaching, but I'd done various bits with Teach First, which was a charity. And before that, before my 4 years of teaching, I was at Cambridge. I matriculated in 2008, which I thought was recently, but is nearly 20 years ago, so it's not. And did various bits of charity stuff there, particularly with SCA, Student Community Action. So yeah, I can talk to some of that as well. But yeah, really keen to answer any questions that you guys have about prisons or charities more generally.
Wonderful, thank you. And Daisy, would you mind going next?
Hi, I'm Daisy. I currently work for the Big Issue Group as a vendor sales and support worker. Previous to this, I worked in sheltered housing in Cambridge for adults with autism, which was kind of run by a social housing organisation. And that was kind of the job that I finished, my first job out of uni. So I went to university at the University of Leeds, and I studied social policy there. So that's kind of my path. So yeah.
Great, thank you. And Sasha.
Hi, yeah, I'm Sasha. I work for a charity called Street League, which is a national charity. It basically helps young people into employment who face any sort of barriers to employment. So whether that be socio-economic background, factors, mental health, any sort of learning difficulty. I went to university in Newcastle. I was studying psychology there. I went to France for a bit to be an au pair, which was kind of like my gap year, I guess you can say. And then I came back, worked in recruitment for a year, hated that, and then worked in the charity sector now.
Lovely, thank you. And Shanyce.
Hi everyone, I'm Shanyce. So I currently work at SmartWorks, which is a women's charity. We help unemployed women get back into work with an interview, dressing and coaching service. So my journey is I went to the London School of Economics for my undergrad. I did politics and international relations. I graduated right when the pandemic started in 2020. And then I knew I wanted to do a master's, but I knew I didn't want to do it immediately. So I took a year out and I worked at Frontline in the selection team. So kind of running virtual assessment centers for about 8 months. And then I started my master's. I went back to LSE, did a master's in international development and humanitarian emergencies. And then while I was doing that, I applied for the SmartWorks graduate scheme, which is what I was on up until like very recently. Yeah, that's a bit about my journey.
Thank you so much. Thank you, everyone. And before we get into any other questions that our attendees had, there was a couple of things I wanted to ask. And one is, whenever I'm talking to students, I always encourage them to talk to people about what are the big things on your mind at the moment? What's keeping you up at night? What are you worried about? What are the things you're really excited about? What do you kind of get up in the morning and think, oh, I can't wait to get my teeth stuck into that in terms of my job? So I won't ask all the questions to everyone, but I thought this one might be useful just to get a bit more of a sense of what's going on with you and in your charity currently. Can we go through in that same order again? Would you mind just sort of sharing your thoughts on that?
Yeah, so if I answer this from two lenses, if I answer it kind of externally focusing for the sector and then internally being someone who works in a prison HQ, or charity HQ rather. So if you look at the prison sector, it's broken and it's very rarely in the news, certainly not for good reasons. I think the most recent time it got proper headlines was when it was in the news that prisons were essentially full and they were changing rules around licensing, bringing people back to prison, so on. And that for us is a really big issue, because if people aren't thinking about it and people aren't hearing about it, they're certainly not pushing for that to be something that is they're talking about on the doorsteps with their MPs. It's not something they're pushing to change. It's not something that leaders in society are making top of their priority list. So a really big priority for us is for the key influencers, key leaders to care about prison. And for us, that's a very pragmatic thing as well. It's not all, oh, everyone in prison is a victim and has, shouldn't be there. It's not that at all. It's that most people, bar the double-digit number of people that are on a whole life tariff, will at some point be released. And what kind of person do you want to be your neighbour? What kind of person do you want living and being involved in the society that you live in? So it's part of being in a sort of dignified and advanced society is having a decent prison system. So that's kind of the societal piece. It's like, please think about this on top of the millions of other things that people think about when they say what are the top 3 issues that you're worried about at the moment: cost of living, everything else. Prisons can really get overlooked. Internally, I hope I'm talking to the right group here when I say getting good staff, getting good people involved in the sector, getting good people involved in the organisation. I just think organisations are make or break is the quality of the people that you've got working in that sector, working in your organisation. Keeping them, especially in a charity, you can't always offer top salaries compared to other sectors. Keeping them happy and trying to make the job really rewarding so they want to stay. I think that's a really key priority for us, kind of looking more internally.
Thank you. And Daisy, and sorry, speakers, do jump in if you've got something to add.
Yeah, I think, to be fair, I second all of what Bodil said. I suppose following the pattern of the kind of external, bigger kind of picture, for my job currently with the big issue, I work kind of frontline with vendors who most of which are insecurely housed, or quite a few are street homeless. So it's kind of looking at the broad picture of kind of housing insecurity in Britain at the moment, and the impact that has on individuals, and how things really need to change. And again, kind of seconding what Bodil said in terms of influencing the kind of big decision makers in terms of who can really make a difference. And I suppose kind of focusing more kind of inwards on myself and kind of my role at the moment. I think, and I suppose what my mentality has been kind of throughout working in the kind of charity or kind of support sector, would be trying to kind of make a difference to people's lives, whether that be me helping someone out with a benefits application, or with helping them to access vouchers, or kind of helping them to update their CV, or in my previous role where I was working with vulnerable adults where they were neurodiverse, kind of helping them to learn certain skills, like kind of daily living skills, and so that they can kind of take that forward and kind of be more kind of included into broader society. And that kind of applies to all of the people that I've worked with. And I think that's the mentality that I've kind of carried through with my work, is kind of making a difference to people's lives and making life maybe that bit easier in such difficult times at the moment. So yeah.
Thank you. And Sasha?
I suppose similar in terms of what Daisy said about wanting to make a difference to people's lives. I think what's weighing on my whole team quite heavily at the moment is the Palestine-Israel conflict. We've got a lot of Muslims that are on our programme, and I'm sure you can imagine that it weighs quite heavily on their hearts, and therefore it weighs quite heavily on our hearts. But then we also work with a lot of people who probably hold quite negative views around refugees and people coming into this country. So for me, what's sort of weighing on what we think about at night is trying to make them have positive feelings about it, because obviously you don't want people in a room full of different people where they don't feel safe. So I think that's what weighs quite heavily on my mind at the moment, and trying to make the people who do see maybe immigration as a negative thing, seeing it in a more positive light, and also helping the refugees, because hopefully whoever is hurt in the Palestine-Israel conflict is able to find sort of safety in another country, in my opinion. I'm sure in a lot of people's opinions, to be able to safely have them over here. So yeah, basically making it a safe place for everyone, I guess.
Thank you.
Oh, great. Yeah. I think it's really interesting, just kind of like reflecting on what the other speakers have said. I guess working at SmartWorks, thinking like externally, we're kind of, I guess, beginning to dip more into like the advocacy space in terms of wanting to create change for what we do. Because being like a women's employment charity, we published a piece of research. We're in our second year of that. And that was like a year-long piece of research where we spoke to over 3,000 clients. And mostly it was just quite honestly really sad, the findings that the cost of living crisis is bad, and a lot of women, because they need to provide for themselves, their children, etc., just want to find any job. They're going for a lot of jobs that they're vastly overqualified for just because they need to put food on the table, and that's the reality of what their lives are. So I think it is interesting thinking more about like what SmartWorks does with that. I think it's a great piece of work, but I think we're definitely thinking more. SmartWorks has just turned 10 years old last year, about like how we can then step into more of a like advocating for change space, and how we actually can do that by amplifying our clients' voices, which is something I think SmartWorks has always consistently done very, very well. On a more like internal basis, funnily enough, this is actually my last week working at SmartWorks. I'm moving into a role in corporate, doing corporate social responsibility, which I guess speaking to students, I never expected myself necessarily to be doing that. I didn't know it was a option. It's more SmartWorks works with a lot of corporate partners. My role is in the partnerships and fundraising team. I ended up working with a lot of people who are going to be doing the role that I'm doing and just learning more about it. And I found it really interesting. But yeah, I think it's definitely, SmartWorks is in a growth phase where I think a lot of charities are, which it is difficult, kind of what Bodil said at the beginning about like growing, but also retaining, and how you kind of keep good people while trying to really expand and trying to like keep the quality of what you do the same as you really grow and expand at the same time. So I think it is an interesting place to be. I think especially when you're in a charity is kind of going from being small to being medium size, and like kind of going through that like tension period of that like scale and what scaling really means. But yeah, that's kind of overall.
Thank you everyone. And actually there's something, you know, all sorts of things that came up multiple times, but what stuck in my mind is really that piece about kind of public awareness, public engagement. And I, as well as looking after the charity sector, look after the policy sector. And I've certainly been talking to clients about here in the UK, you know, we've got a general election coming. It's an interesting time to be trying to get sort of attention, perhaps on the causes and issues that you really care about, at a time when maybe politicians are particularly aware of public opinion with the upcoming election. So that struck me as well. I said we would go over to some questions from our clients, and this chat is very quiet. So if you have any questions, attendees, please do put them in the chat. Really, you know, anything small or large. If you don't want to kind of put it out there publicly, I'm really happy for you to message me personally, and I'll keep it anonymous. I won't mention your name. We have got some questions that people submitted in advance as well, so we can talk through those. But if there's anything on your mind, let us know. Before we get to that, you know, sort of emailed actually all of our panelists in advance. I was saying, you know, there's been quite a lot of conversation in the last few years about the charity sector and how diverse it is, or perhaps isn't, whether there is representation from sorts of different groups, including maybe people with lived experience of the cause that the charity supports. And I know, Shanyce, you said you'd done some work in that area and had something you wanted to kind of share with us on that.
Yeah, so SmartWorks launched their first equity, diversity, inclusion strategy in 2023, so earlier last year, and it's something I ended up being very heavily involved in. I did some similar work at Frontline, but more on a recruitment piece. It's just something I'm generally quite passionate about. So I thought I could give a little bit of insight. I think like probably post 2020 and speaking to other, mostly just like people of color who work in the charity sector, I think things are like improving and there's a lot of goodwill, but I think there's always more ways to go. And I think probably fundamentally, it's just, I think for everyone in the sector, being comfortable with being uncomfortable is like the first step that you have to get to do diversity and inclusion and to really make people feel included. And I think not be afraid to get things wrong. I think if you're interested in going into the sector, I think most sectors struggle with diversity, right? Like it's not unique to the charity sector, but I think it is unique because you're often dealing with people who are quite different from you potentially. And I think it's just having to have the courage to say that I might mess this up, but that's okay. And that's, I think, ultimately where everyone kind of needs to get to progress. And I would say for people who are kind of from different backgrounds who might be interested in going to the charity sector and worried about levels of diversity, I would say it's something I actually just said to someone else on a call. Just, I think, don't be scared to make your thoughts and opinions known. If you see something that you don't think is okay, or if you see something that needs to change, you don't really get anything from being scared. And the worst thing that can happen is that nothing changes. But like the best thing that can happen is that you made your thoughts known. I think I came into SmartWorks and there was things that I definitely wanted to change, or things I probably could have pushed for a lot earlier that I didn't feel comfortable doing because I was like, oh, I've just finished a master's, I'm not professional enough to do this. But I think as I grew in my confidence and grew in my role, I realized that like you always have a voice and you should use that voice. And if you see something that you think needs to be changed, then you should. I think, especially also as people who are kind of graduating uni and looking to go into the sector, asking charities about what they're doing on diversity and inclusion is a really good question in an interview. Mostly because it's going to show that you're thinking strategically, but also if they're not doing anything, I think it can be quite a startling question, but it will always make you very memorable. And it's probably also something, if it is important to you, you want to know about. But yeah, I think just don't be afraid to kind of use your voice and kind of speak up in that way, because I think there is a lot of goodwill and charities want to be doing more, but sometimes they're not maybe at the position or the level where they're always thinking about it. A lot of trustee boards aren't very diverse, but if you can be that voice, like take it upon yourself. Like I would say, don't hold yourself back from pushing forward things where you can, would be my main thing I wanted to say there.
Great, thank you. And other panelists, please do jump in if you've got something to add. Bodil, I'm sure
Just
you
want to chime in a little bit there, if that's okay. Just building on what you said before, we have an equality and diversity panel in my current company that is hosted once a month. It's something that I didn't have in my last place of work, and you can really see that, and you can put yourself forward to be part of it. So it's not something that your manager chooses you to be on, it's something that you choose to be a part of. And I think that gives people a voice. So maybe if you do start working somewhere and they don't have that, it could be a good suggestion to create that.
And Beka, looping back to your, sorry, Daisy, go ahead.
No, you're fine.
Just looping back to the lived experience point, that's something that's really important to us at Unlocked, because there can be a very us and them attitude between prison staff and people who've got lived experience of being in prison. So two things that we've really prioritised and that the sector was absolutely horrified by when we first started in 2017 is including an ex-prisoner on our interview panel for the graduate scheme. And they score alongside a serving prison officer. And then in the classroom as well, during training, there is someone with lived experience alongside the trainer. So that means if you can imagine teaching full search, so essentially a strip search, you can imagine how blasé someone who's been in the service for 25 years might get about that experience. But if you've got someone who's sitting there saying, do you know what? Being asked to bend over and spread my bum cheeks, like imagine being what on the receiving end of that is like. And yes, you can, there's a temptation in that setting, I think, for people to like make a joke, to make a bit of light of it. Never do that at the prisoner's expense. And just bringing that reality to the forefront, I think it's the thing we consistently get the most positive feedback about in our training. And it's a good example of people tell you it can't be done. Like security will say no, like you just can't do it. It's like there's one or two sessions where that's the case, where there's genuinely something security sensitive that someone who's not been out of prison and who's been risk assessed as being quite low risk can't hear. But 99% of what we do hugely benefits from that voice of lived experience. And that obviously intersects with so many other different characteristics as well, including race. I mean, racial inequality in prison is atrocious. If you look at somewhere like Feltham Young Offenders Institution, it's something like 75% are Black African or Black Caribbean, predominantly Black Caribbean. There's really deep levels of inequality throughout the prison system, throughout the justice system, as you'd expect. So there's loads more to do in that space. But I think, yeah, as Shanyce says, like raising it and talking about it is the first amongst many steps of trying to improve that.
Yeah, I was sorry, I was just gonna chime in and say about the Big Issue group kind of runs a it's a scheme called Equals to Equals, where basically the company will work with vendors who are out on the street, work with them to kind of give them employment skills so they can progress up it actually into the company in some instances. So we work a lot with the Roma community. A large proportion of vendors are from the Roma community. So we kind of work with them to try and understand the different cultural things that they have, and so we can consider that when working with them, and also because they are largely marginalized in society and face a huge amount of inequality, Equals to Equals was a scheme to try and combat that and try and get a larger proportion of the Roma community, especially that we work with at the Big Issue, and give them the skills that they can take forward with them into employment. And actually one of my colleagues now at the moment, she is from the Roma community and she progressed to her position now through the Equals to Equals scheme. So it's those kind of little schemes that I think, well, big schemes, sorry, that actually quite a few charities and different companies are doing now to kind of level that balance as much as they can with kind of marginalized communities, especially in the Big Issues case, the Roma community, which a large proportion of our vendors are. So yeah.
Just to add on to what Daisy said there, one of our programs that we deliver functional skills, maths and English qualifications to the young people in 12 weeks. Our functional skills tutor, John, he was actually part of the programme about 10 years ago as a student. And I think obviously I work in Liverpool, so I'm with a bunch of Scousers. They hear my accent and think, God, she's dead posh, doesn't get it, which obviously I completely get. So then hearing his story where he's like a proper Scouse lad and like he's been through the programme himself as a student and now works for the charity as like a very senior role, teaching them maths and English is really inspiring for them. So I think seeing someone that you can sort of identify with is good for both the charity itself and for the people you're working with.
Yeah, thank you. And I said, look, we might not go through every single person for every question, but it's just so great to have all of your contributions there, and really interesting to kind of hear that breadth of experiences. Daisy, do you need to go? I'm looking at the time and I know you had to leave us a little early.
I'm all right for five more minutes. I'm all good.
What I might do then to make the most of you before you go, and I've got a couple of questions and I've had some come in anonymously as well to ask, but just while we've still got you, and I might start with you, we've had so many questions about different types of work experience. Is it necessary to do unpaid work experience? Is it necessary to do a graduate scheme in a charity? Could you just sort of, is it necessary to do something voluntary without being paid? Could you just talk a little bit about that and your experience of going into the work that you do?
Yeah, of course. So I myself didn't do any voluntary work to get into the sector that I started in. Obviously, I said that I started working as a whilst I was at university, I was lucky enough to kind of, for my part-time kind of my work that I do in holidays and stuff to get myself a bit extra money, I actually managed to get into the job that I had kind of finished about 4 months ago. So I started off as a relief support worker in the scheme that I was in. So that was kind of more casual work. So it worked for me in terms of I could do it on my holidays when I was back at home. But it also gave me like really good experience in terms of working with vulnerable adults and the kind of the issues and kind of things to overcome with that. So it gave me a lot of experience in kind of working with them. And then I was lucky enough when I graduated to be offered a kind of fixed term contract there. So that was when I was kind of promoted to as I think my title was support officer. So that was what I did. And in terms of experience, my degree was in social policy. So I was through that, I learned a lot about the kind of current affairs and different social issues and government stuff. So it's quite a broad degree. I think narrowing down on that to a career, because I knew I wanted to work in the charity sector, but in terms of getting that experience, it can be quite overwhelming to think, okay, what can I do with all of these different issues, and how can I try to tackle all of them, if any of them, do you know what I mean? So I think, yeah, it's worth looking just at kind of, I think for me, in terms of getting through my job now, I needed experience in kind of supporting people and working with people who are marginalised or have support needs, or from lots of different backgrounds. So I think, speaking to students now, I think for me in my position, I think it's really key to get that kind of work experience, whether it's paid or unpaid. So it could even be, I know people that have kind of done a similar part to me, working part-time in kind of different care facilities or charities, or kind of more as like an admin role, or as like a volunteer working with people who use the charity or access the charity. I think that's a really good step up. And then, like, once you're kind of in, you get so much experience. Like, I'm forever grateful for the first job that I had, in terms of the experience that it gave me, and the skills that kind of you develop by working with kind of charities and seeing the way that it's organised. It really gives you a good taste of kind of whether that's for you or not, and in that case it was for me. And just, it's a really fulfilling thing to do, to make a difference. And I think in terms of voluntary work, if you have the time and resources to do that, I wish I had time for voluntary work, just in terms of developing those skills in the charity sector, because it is really valuable. And I think going into that sector, you do require kind of certain people skills and a general awareness about kind of social issues, especially if you're going into, it depends what charity you're going into, but I think having a broad understanding of social issues, how charities work, how kind of support services work, because that is, most charities will have an element of that, I think is really important. If you can kind of get that experience while you're still at university, I think it's super valuable. And I think even when, for me, applying for the current role that I am now, actually looking at my CV and seeing actually all of the different skills that I've acquired through that first initial job where I was kind of working part-time, it's really, it shows well on your CV, and it is really important. So yeah, that's a roundabout way of what I'd say.
That's great. Thank you so much, and thank you for giving us your time this evening as well. We really appreciate it.
That's all right. Thanks so much.
Building on that sort of idea of learning how charities work, we've actually had a question. I don't know if it's from the same person. I had a similar question pre-submitted about, as charities grow and change, and how that kind of changes the nature of them. I know in previous years we've also had people asking about different sizes of charities, what it's like to work for somewhere very small, somewhere large, and they said, perhaps particularly Bodil and Shanyce, you might be able to talk about this in terms of watching Unlocked from its early days grow, and then Shanyce, you were saying SmartWorks is right on that pivot of becoming bigger, becoming medium. Bodil, do you want to start us off?
Yeah. This is a really important point, actually, because if you go onto Charity Commission website, there's some good graphics of this, but the vast majority of charities are absolutely tiny. If you look at pure numbers, it's something like over half of them, I think, don't even have one full-time employee. So when you're thinking about the whole charity sector, you're probably not going to work for an charity if you pulled a name out of that hat, because that charity probably is entirely reliant on volunteers. In terms of growing, so I was the third ever employee at Unlocked, and now we've got, if you include our sessional staff, over 100. So our growth has predominantly been through government contracts. So that's one way of doing it. You can get very well acquainted with the government procurement portals, which are about as much fun as they sound, but it's a necessary evil if you want to get your money that way. And then the alternative route, our other main route, is kind of private donations and grants from big trusts and foundations, which again requires, it's partly relational, but also partly about, the kind of pictures you put in. And that is, I know someone asked about kind of income in the charity sector. That is potentially one way, if you want a higher paid role in the charity sector, is to go down the fundraiser route, because you can really earn your keep there. You know, some charities have a very kind of simple, as a fundraiser you have to earn, let's say, 7 times your income as your target for that year or something like that. So I wouldn't be, I'm answering a couple of questions here, but I wouldn't be, don't paint every single charity with the same brush. There are some charities that actually pay quite competitively with the private sector, because they have, their board has set the strategy that in order to get the best outcomes for whatever their charitable aims are, they need to recruit from certain sectors, or they need to remain competitive, and therefore that's a strategic way that they do that. You can go to, on the Charity Commission website, again, you can go to any charity of your choice, type in their name and see their annual accounts, and on one of the notes in those accounts it will tell you the breakdown of the number of staff paid at every income bracket. So therefore you can basically see, okay, if the CEO is going to be the highest paid person realistically, right? So if they're if you've got one employee in the 150k to 160k bracket, you can pretty much tell what that person's going to be paid. If you're looking at a senior leadership role in that organization, well, it's probably going to be 4 or 5 people. So what band has got like 3, 4, 5 people in that band? And that can be a really good way to kind of set your expectations and understand what you might be looking at, either at the beginning of your career or towards the end of your career. You only have to report, I think it's £60,000 upwards on that. It's just to like a measure that they've taken for charities to make sure that there's no crazy outside salaries being unwittingly taken. Think tanks, someone mentioned in particular, are kind of notoriously not brilliantly paid, which again I think is an equity issue. It means that people who have mum and dad in London to stay in the spare room, unfortunately it can be easier for them to get by on that low salary for a couple of years before they might go into quite a well-paid sort of advocacy role for a lobbying firm or something like that. So that's the cynical side, is that there is unfortunately still some of that. If I talk specifically for unlocked graduates and what we look for both on the scheme and in HQ, it's that I don't think there's much that you can't do as a transferable skill. I think practically everything is transferable from paid employment, hobbies, etc. And we want someone who shows an interest in the sector. But to be honest, that can be as much as being like, I've read an article about this in the news and I've thought more deeply about it than the average person. I'm just as excited to see that as I am someone who's volunteered for free, because we understand that that's just not possible for everyone.
Wonderful, thank you for that really comprehensive, just pulling in lots of things in the chat. I was going to slightly do that to Shanyce as well, because as we were talking about the growth of SmartWorks, someone had also asked for a little bit more detail on that idea of moving from research into advocacy, and if you can pull in something on that as well, that would be really helpful.
Yeah, definitely. I think so SmartWorks has grown a lot in the past 10 years. I've been there for a year and a half, and I think we went, when I started, probably from maybe like 20 or 30 staff in London, or maybe no, yeah, 20 or 30 staff, between like 30 and 50 across the UK, and now we're like up to 70. Like, it's definitely grown very, very rapidly. And I think there's definitely, like, I wouldn't say pros and cons. There's just different experiences that you have, I think, in an organization that's growing really rapidly, because I think, number one, you get a lot of opportunity to do a lot of different things. I think that's kind of, if you're thinking about different sizes of organizations, I think the benefit of starting at SmartWorks when we did is that you can kind of just say that you were interested in something and then you end up kind of doing it, which is quite useful for me. Like, I had done some volunteering during the pandemic, helping a really small charity in Hounslow write grants, and I was like, oh, I'd like to like learn a bit more about that. And then so that's how that kind of ended up being my role. Same with the EDI stuff. I said, oh, I'm mildly interested in this, and then that ended up being half of my role. So I think that is really useful, because I think it does help you develop quite rapidly. But then at the same time, you are dealing with the fact that the organization is really growing and scaling. And that does often like come with its challenges, because the bigger that you get and the more roles that are filled, those kind of opportunities to move into wherever you want do then become a little bit more limited. And I also think with SmartWorks, we don't seek any government funding. So someone put a question in terms of like, sorry, I live on a main road, so this can get very loud sometimes. Someone put in a question about how charities grow in terms of income. We currently have chosen to not seek any government funding to like retain flexibility. That's just a senior leadership decision that's been made, but that means all our income comes from grants, trusts and foundations, corporate partnerships and events. And I would say, Bodil was talking about like choosing to be a fundraiser. I think depending where you are a fundraiser can be very, very stressful when you're trying to like hit a really high target, especially in a cost of living crisis where people though have very good will. They just have less money. They have less money to give out. Corporates generally aren't necessarily having as much money to give out. Individuals definitely don't have as much money to give out. But I think it comes with a lot of challenges, but it is also genuinely very interesting work as well. I think also from a relationship building perspective, like I very much found out that I am a people person. I've never described myself as such before I did this role, because I like interacting with people and kind of learned that through that. I think in terms of the growth from like research into advocacy, it's still something SmartWorks I think is trying to figure out, because I think it's an organization that has never really taken like any kind of hard political stance. And I think the view is that that is to continue, but it is also very, I think, difficult to kind of do advocacy in a neutral way. And I think it's something that they're going to have to try and figure out how to navigate. And I think, yeah, I think mostly the view is like getting the research in front of the right people. But again, that is very hard. I think potentially an election year might be slightly easier. But it's tough, I think, because you do, I think, at least in my view, it's difficult to advocate for groups on their behalf without kind of taking a stance on what you think things should look like. And taking that stance can mean saying that the way we're doing things now shouldn't be done. And that is then kind of gets you kind of wound up. Personally, I don't think you can separate advocacy and politics, but I think that is kind of the tension that they're dealing with right now. But yeah, I think it always is an interesting time, I think, working in a bigger organization, a growing organization. And I think on the question I saw the one about, just to chat very briefly on it, about kind of the cost of living crisis and pay, et cetera. I think also being really realistic with where you are. Like part of the reason, very honestly speaking, to graduates, I'm seeking a new job is because like my family lives abroad, and with the cost of living crisis, the salary I was on, I wouldn't be able to see them very often. And that's just not a sacrifice I'm willing to make at this point in my life. And I think it's just, you have to be realistic with where you are, and also be aware that this sector isn't also going anywhere. Like if what's going to work best for you right now is to go do something else, you can always move into the sector later on in your career. It's actually also, I think, more people than you expect do other things in their life and then move into the sector. I would say so many of my team at SmartWorks had previous jobs and then decided to move into the sector. So not necessarily getting stressed about the fact that like you're never going to be able to do it. You're probably going to be working for the next 40 odd years. You have plenty of time to kind of switch things around, and you could do something else for a while and then move into the charity sector. And that I think speaks again to the point about internships and work experience. Experience is experience. I'm very against like unpaid internships, because I think do something where you can earn a living, because you're going to get transferable skills from that regardless. Like I was speaking to a colleague before this, she worked in service, so she was a server for like I think 2-3 years before she moved into her role at SmartWorks. And I think in her interview she was saying, oh, this isn't really relevant. They're like, of course it is. Like you were working with people. What you're going to do in this job is working with people. That's transferable skills. So like I think maybe don't get too stressed about it. Like if you need to take a job so that you have enough money to live and pay your bills, etc., you can still have those transferable skills to then get into the role that you want. And I would, yeah, I'm very much against people doing unpaid labor, because I think that like, though it might seem like you have to, you really don't, because skills are skills. I'd say focus on the skills you're getting out of anything rather than maybe the company name or the organization, because those skills do transfer. It might take you a little bit of work, but you are developing as you're doing any kind of experience, regardless of what it is. Sorry, I feel like I just covered like 3 questions in one, but I hope that was helpful.
No, it's really great. And, I want to say to the attendees who might not have been to our previous charity panels, that kind of message just comes up again and again about, really experience from a variety of perspectives being really valued. People working in the sector know the challenges that doing unpaid internships brings. And I've never, in my years of doing these panels, I've never heard someone say, oh, no, you have to have done that. Very much I hear what we've heard tonight, which is completely understand, do what works for you. We would love to have you when you're ready. I wanted to come to Sasha next and talk a little bit. We've had a couple of questions again previously and some in the chat as well about just tips on standing out in your applications. And I think it builds quite nicely on Shanyce's point there about, you know, maybe if you're talking about other experiences, relevant or not, is there anything that you found really helped you when you were making applications, that you think made a difference to you getting the role that you have?
I think it's hard to put across everything you want to in a CV. So I think, like Shanyce said, do just go off your transferable skills. So obviously I work for an employment charity now. I used to be a recruiter, so I played on that a lot, obviously, to get to where I am. But I think it's about when you actually go to the interview and you can sit down with these people face to face and really just saying why you're passionate about it. So the reason I wanted to work for the charity I currently work for is because a lot of these young people didn't have the nicest childhoods, and that's why that they sort of face all these barriers to employment. I'm really lucky I didn't have the nicest childhood, but I also ended up getting a good job and working. So it's similar pathways, but taking two different paths. And that's why I was so passionate about making other people take the same path that I was fortunate enough to take. And I think portraying that in your interview and letting them know why you're passionate about it. Also mentioning what the transferable skills you have, but the charity sector is generally about helping people. So knowing that you're passionate about helping people and wanting to do that is, I think, half the battle, because skills can be taught, whereas they do generally, I know for my charity, want people there who want to make a difference. But yeah, that's all I can really say on that.
Yeah, and again, I think that kind of builds on things I've heard other people saying as well. We've had a couple of questions coming in, and I mentioned at the beginning we've got all sorts of students, PhDs included. We've got postdocs that we support as well, and we've had a couple of questions about the entry level from those points. I don't think we've got anyone on the panel today with a PhD or a postdoc, but if you can kind of think more broadly about your organisation, have you seen anyone come in with those skills? If you were recruiting, how would you feel if you had someone who'd maybe started on that academic career path but now wanted to make a change? I think it picks up a little bit on what you were saying as well, Shanyce, about people coming in, you know, from all sorts of other careers. I'll throw this open to whoever would like to start us off.
I've got a really brilliant member of my team who was an academic for several years, did his PhD, kind of was trying to find his way for a couple of years, and is now our Associate Director of Impact and Insights. So his job basically is to figure out, take all of this really rich data that we've got from the graduate scheme, the stakeholders we work with, and present really actionable insights for us. And it's so incredible as a leadership team to go from like, oh, I've got this kind of vibe that like a prison's going in this direction, a prison's getting more challenging, and for him to be like, yeah, here's your data, black and white. It's like, this is the graph. So there are roles like that. If you've got a more, he's got a very mixed methods background, so he's like, he'll turn his hand to anything. But if that's your kind of social sciences stuff, I'd say there's definitely roles like that out there. If it's more specifically maybe on a different policy, I think this touches on a question that someone put in the chat around making speculative applications. I would say, given that there are a lot of quite small charities out there, I think there's really no harm in connecting with someone on LinkedIn and saying, hey, I'm a real specialist in this area. There's probably not that many of us that have written a dissertation on this kind of topic, like bear me in mind. It's not always going to be the way that every organisation operates, but it can be no bad thing to be on the radar of those people. And you're always going to find someone on LinkedIn, and you're always going to probably be able to work out someone's email address as well if you really want to, from their website address and their name. So I don't think there's any harm in doing that. Most people, if you're keen, they just want to have people like that in their network. They're not going to be offended.
Is it okay if I just add something on that? I just wanted to, on the LinkedIn point, I think particularly something I probably needed to hear when I was a student is, do not be afraid to just reach out to people on LinkedIn. I feel like it's so useful, and the worst thing that's going to happen is someone's not going to reply to you. No one's going to be like, no, I hate that. Like, no, like the worst thing they're going to do is just not respond. And I think like it's such an underused tool. I did it a lot, even like during my time at SmartWorks, when I was like, I don't really know what I want to do next. Just chatting to people about how they got their jobs and like what they enjoy, what they don't, just allows you to know a lot more about what's out there and like what you could be doing that you can't really get if you're just kind of bogged down looking at applications all day on your computer. Like I really, really recommend like connecting with people, asking for like 30-minute chats, because the worst thing someone's going to say is no or not respond. And it's just really, really useful and important.
Yeah, thank you so much. And I'm just going to tag on the end of that as well and say I always encourage people, have a look at LinkedIn for some of these questions about what kind of work experience do people have, even if you don't talk to them. Look for someone who's got a job you want, and what internships did they have? Did they get experience in the private sector first? Did they, do something in academia first? Is a really nice way to find things out as well. We're getting to the stage where I'm going to have to be a bit selective about the questions that we've got. I am quite interested in the one that's come up about working in a geographical area that's different for your own. I mean, this one is kind of particularly aimed at Sasha because you were talking about your accent in Liverpool, but I wonder if Shanyce, you might have something to add here as well about, you were talking about, kind of going home and working in the UK. How has that experience been? Has it been difficult? Has it been easy? Sasha, if you want to start us off.
Sorry, my mic wouldn't turn on. I was trying to get on. Do you know what? So, like I said before, as soon as they all hear me talk, all my students, all my young people, and I get it everywhere, just living in Liverpool anyway. As soon as I'm in the pub and people hear me, they go, "Where are you from?" Like, it's not the most common accent up here. And I suppose it probably does take a little bit more time for people to buy into you, especially the people you're working with, or I found so. But I think the best thing you can do is, one, especially if you're looking at going to Manchester, I was just having a look at your message then, there's a lot of Southerners in Manchester, I wouldn't worry so much about that. Liverpool, there's not so many of us up here, but it's getting the buy-in from them. So for me, I go, yeah, like I don't sound like you, but we probably have this in common, or finding something that we have common ground on. And I think that's what I did in my interview. I sort of explained my own personal experiences and why I think I'd relate to the students. So yeah, okay, it might be a little bit more challenging, but I think that's part about breaking down barriers and sort of different, like what you associate people with. So people associate Southerners with having loads of money and not really caring about people, and then on the flip side of that, people might think that Northerners aren't very welcoming to Southerners and sort of stick to their own. And again, if you can get the buy-in from them by relating them to on a different level to what you sound like or where you come from, I think that's really helpful.
Yeah, thank you. I've just realised I did have another question come into me anonymously. There's a really quick one for Shanyce, which is the SmartWorks graduate scheme running this year? Do you know? I haven't seen it. I normally put it in the newsletter.
No, yeah, I don't think it's running this year, but we are always like hiring, including for just like entry-level roles. So I would always recommend just kind of, if you follow SmartWorks on like both Instagram and LinkedIn, they'll just be advertising roles, and it's the charity is very much growing, and not just like in London, like across the UK, and there's a lot of roles available. So I would just recommend kind of like following along and see, there'll be a lot of entry-level opportunities.
And Bodil, I think Unlocked is open at the moment, isn't it? We've got applications open, so that one's certainly going. Interestingly, some of the graduate schemes, or what would traditionally be called graduate schemes in some charities, have now dropped the graduate element. So I know Oxfam, for example, their entry-level scheme is not called a graduate scheme because you don't need a degree, and that's part of what we were talking about earlier with kind of encouraging people from different backgrounds in. So if you're looking for the words graduate scheme, you might be missing out on a couple of things like that as well. So that's worth bearing in mind. And we're coming towards the end of our time. I think we've covered hopefully most of the questions that are in the chat between us. I'm just looking to see what else came in advance. I think the main thing that we hadn't covered perhaps was the salary piece, which we have talked about a little bit. And I can certainly send around some resources in the email afterwards about typical salaries in the graduate scheme. But yeah, doing your research is really helpful. I might ask our panelists to kind of finish by just if there was one kind of thing that you wish you knew when you were a student yourself. A couple of those things have already come up. If there was one really key message you wanted to give to people thinking about careers in this area, what might it be? While they're thinking, and I will give you a few moments to think, I've just put a feedback survey in the chat. It really does help us participants if you can fill it in. It doesn't take long. It's really brief, kind of 30 seconds, just a couple of questions, but we genuinely read every single one. We're coming to the end of this careers festival for policy, charities and development, and we're about to do a big review and look at where we got things right and where we got things wrong, and we'd really love to have your help with that, so please do fill that in. Shall we go back to our alphabets just for simplicity? And Bodil, could you start us with your big thing you wish you knew, or one thing?
Yeah,
you remember?
I think it kind of speaks to something Shanyce said earlier, which is there are so many routes into one particular job. I really wouldn't get overly fixated on I have to have had this entry-level job to get to this next step, to get to this next step. And related to that, be savvy about networking. Like you would be really surprised at who in different sectors can end up helping you out, or has a connection to this person, or somehow will introduce you to someone, which can be the difference between you coming across an opportunity or not coming across it.
Great, thank you so much. Sasha?
I'd say just don't feel pigeonholed just because you've done a certain degree. Maybe you've even done a PhD in it. I wouldn't let yourself pigeon yourself into that. Like, I would say make sure that you're looking at jobs that you genuinely have an interest in, and like I say, hopefully that'll come across in the interview. But I don't think anyone's ever sort of sectioned off into working for a particular sector in the charity industry. I think once you, even if you have to go for one of those jobs when you originally straight come out of uni, because they're the graduate schemes you can get on, I think, like we've mentioned before, the transferable skills mean that you can transfer and you can go elsewhere. But I wouldn't beat yourself up if the first job you get isn't the perfect job, because it doesn't mean you're going to be stuck in that industry for the rest of your life.
Great. I think I'm just going to elaborate on what Sasha said. And it was funny, we had like a network meeting with some of my colleagues before. I was like, oh, what would you guys say? And someone said this right at the end. And I think it is a really great point that it's kind of what Sasha just said, though. Like, your first job does not have to be your dream job, and it does not have to be the job you do forever. And you're going to also change and evolve if you start working. Like, if you would have told me now when I started at SmartWorks that I would be the person I am now professionally, I would have laughed. I've been like, there's no way that would ever be me. But you grow and you change so much, especially in your early career journey and just in your early 20s generally. So just don't feel like whatever you're doing has to be what you're doing forever. You can grow and evolve within your charity or into a different charity. So just kind of like be open to kind of where life takes you and where your interests and experiences take you, and not be too worried about finding exactly the right fit right now, because what's the right fit right now might not be the right fit in a year and a half. And that's fine.